A Hells Angel biker is stranded on a lonely Alabama highway when 3 black mechanics pull over to help him fix a flat tire. He expects judgment, maybe fear, but instead, they treat him like a brother. The next day, he rides back to thank them, only to find their entire garage burned to the ground. That's when everything changes. He offers to help rebuild, but his old biker crew sees it as betrayal. And as he picks up a hammer instead of a weapon, the world around him starts watching, some with awe, others with hate. What happens when a man known for destruction tries to build something good, when grace shows up where it's least expected, and when standing for what's right could cost him everything? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The Alabama sun beat down mercilessly on the empty county road, waves of heat rippling off the cracked asphalt. Randy Diesel Carson leaned forward on his Harley, the familiar rumble of the engine vibrating through his weathered leather vest. His long gray hair whipped behind him, the only relief from the oppressive afternoon heat. The open road had always been his sanctuary. Here, with nothing but miles of highway stretching before him, he could forget about his past, about the things he'd done. The road didn't judge. It just welcomed him, mile after empty mile. Then came the sudden pop, loud as a gunshot. The front tire jerked violently, and Randy's heart jumped into his throat as the bike lurched sideways. Years of riding experience kicked in as he fought to keep the Harley upright, gradually easing it onto the dusty shoulder beside an old Phillips 66 sign, its blue and red paint peeling away like sunburned skin. "Damn it all to hell," Randy growled, kicking at the flat tire. He pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his vest pocket, lit one with hands that still shook slightly from the near crash, and leaned against his bike. The smoke curled up into the orange-streaked sky as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. Hours crept by. A few cars passed, but none stopped. Randy wasn't surprised. One look at his tattoo-covered arms, his Hells Angels patches, and most folks decided to keep right on driving. He'd run out of cigarettes and patience when he heard the distinctive rumble of a diesel engine approaching. A battered tow truck, its white paint more rust than anything else, pulled up beside him. Randy straightened, his hand instinctively moving towards the knife at his belt. 3 black men stepped out, and Randy's jaw tightened. In his experience, different races mixing on lonely roads usually meant trouble. The oldest of the 3 approached first, his movements calm and deliberate. He was broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that seemed to look right through Randy's tough guy facade. "Looks like you could use a hand, brother," the man said, extending his own. "I'm Calvin Booker. There's Marcus." He gestured to a lean man with quick, clever eyes. "And the young one's Darnell." Randy hesitated before taking Calvin's hand. "Randy Carson," he said gruffly. "Front tire blew." "Well now, ain't that something we can fix?" Marcus grinned, already moving toward the truck's toolbox. "Good thing we was heading back from that job in Montgomery, huh?" Darnell, the youngest, approached the bike with obvious admiration. "That's a beautiful machine, sir. Mind if I take a look?" Something in the kid's genuine enthusiasm made Randy's guard drop a notch. "Go ahead," he muttered. The 3 men worked together like a well-oiled machine. Calvin directed with quiet authority, Marcus kept up a steady stream of jokes and stories, and Darnell's careful hands showed surprising skill for someone so young. Randy found himself drawn into their easy camaraderie, despite his best efforts to maintain his distance. "So what brings you down these parts?" Marcus asked, as he helped Calvin position the jack under the Harley. "Just passing through," Randy said shortly, not wanting to admit he was running from memories that seemed to chase him wherever he went. "Sometimes passing through is exactly what a man needs," Calvin replied, his voice carrying a weight of understanding that made Randy look at him sharply. As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the road, they not only patched his tire but topped off his gas tank from a can in their truck. When they finished, Randy reached for his wallet, but Calvin held up a hand. "We don't charge a man who's stranded, brother," he said simply. Randy stared at him, confusion and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame, churning in his gut. "I can't just—" "Sure you can," Marcus interrupted with a smile. "Pass it on someday, that's all we ask." Darnell wiped his hands on a rag and stepped back to admire their work. "She's ready to ride, Mr. Carson. Safe travels." Randy swung his leg over the seat, started the engine, and with a brief nod, rode off into the gathering dusk. But something had shifted inside him, like a key turning in a lock he didn't know existed. Later that night, lying on a lumpy mattress in a cheap motel room, Randy stared at the water-stained ceiling. The room's window unit hummed and rattled, but it couldn't drown out the echoes of the afternoon. Marcus's easy laughter, Darnell's quiet respect, and most of all, Calvin's words. "We don't charge a man who's stranded, brother." Brother. When was the last time someone had called him that and meant it? Not as a term of obligation or fear, but as a simple statement of human connection. Randy rolled onto his side, punching the flat pillow in frustration. He couldn't shake the memory of how they'd treated him, not like the dangerous biker he was, but like any other man who needed help. No judgment, no fear, no ulterior motives. Just 3 men helping a stranger because it was the right thing to do. The clock on the bedside table blinked 12:23 in harsh red numbers, but sleep remained elusive. Randy's mind kept circling back to that moment by the old gas station sign, to the unexpected kindness that had blindsided him more effectively than any sucker punch he'd ever taken. Why? The question nagged at him like a persistent itch. Why would they help someone like him? They owed him nothing. Hell, most people would say they owed him less than nothing, given the patches he wore and the life he'd lived. Yet they'd treated him like he mattered. The ceiling fan spun lazily overhead, casting wobbling shadows across the walls. Randy listened to the distant rumble of trucks on the highway and remembered how Calvin's hands had moved with such sure purpose, how Marcus had shared water from his own thermos without hesitation, how young Darnell had looked at his bike with genuine appreciation instead of fear. It wasn't just that they'd helped him. It was how they'd helped him, with dignity, with respect, with a kind of casual grace that made him feel both grateful and unworthy at the same time. Randy pushed himself up and sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The tough, calloused shell he'd built around himself over decades of hard living felt suddenly fragile, cracking just enough to let in a dangerous question. What if there was another way to live? The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Randy kicked his Harley to life. His restless night had left him with dark circles under his eyes, but also with a determination he couldn't shake. The plastic bag hanging from his handlebar held a 6-pack of cold beer and 2 containers of pulled pork from Big Jim's BBQ stand, steam still rising from the morning fresh meat. The roads were quiet as he navigated back toward town, rehearsing what he'd say to the mechanics. Simple thanks seemed inadequate, but anything more felt uncomfortable on his tongue. As he rounded the bend where yesterday's breakdown had occurred, his heart suddenly lurched in his chest. Thick black smoke rose against the morning sky, twisting like a malevolent snake above the tree line. Randy twisted the throttle, the Harley's engine roaring as he sped toward Cal's auto repair. The acrid smell of burnt rubber and melted metal hit him before he could see the devastation. The garage was a skeleton of its former self. Blackened beams reached toward the sky like accusing fingers. Tools lay scattered and ruined across the lot, wrenches warped by intense heat, toolboxes reduced to puddles of metal. The concrete floor was stained with soot and water from the firefighters' efforts. But what struck Randy hardest was the sight of Calvin, Marcus, and Darnell. They sat in mismatched folding chairs amid the destruction, sharing a thermos of coffee as if they were just starting another ordinary workday. Their faces showed weariness, but there was a dignity in their calm that made Randy's blood boil even hotter. "What the hell happened here?" Randy demanded, killing his engine and swinging off his bike so fast he nearly knocked it over. Calvin looked up, his eyes tired but clear. "Fire started sometime after midnight," he said quietly. "Neighbor called it in, but by then—" He gestured at the ruins around them. A patrol car crunched over broken glass as it pulled into the lot. Sheriff Don Atkins stepped out, his face grim. "Calvin?" He nodded, then eyed Randy suspiciously. "Got the preliminary report from the fire marshal. It was arson, no doubt about it." Randy's fists clenched. "You got proof?" The sheriff jerked his thumb toward the back wall, one of the few sections still standing. Crude letters had been spray-painted in red. "Go back where you came from." Darnell stood up suddenly, walking away from the group. Marcus watched him go, his usual smile nowhere to be seen. "Kid's taking it hard," he said softly. "This shop was his first real chance, you know?" Randy felt something snap inside him. "You can't just sit here drinking coffee. This is wrong. Let me help. I know people. We can find out who did this. We'll manage," Calvin interrupted, his voice steady. "God's still good." Those words hit Randy like a physical blow. He stared at Calvin, trying to understand how anyone could maintain such faith in the face of such hatred. It made him angry, not at Calvin, but at a world where good men could lose everything and still choose peace over vengeance. "That's it?" Randy's voice was rough. "Someone burns down your life's work and you just say, 'God's still good'?" Calvin met his gaze. "What would you have me say instead?" Randy opened and closed his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at the beer and barbecue in his hands, meant as a thank you, but now seeming absurdly inadequate. Wordlessly, he set them down beside their chairs. The morning breeze carried the smell of smoke and ash as Randy mounted his bike again. He could feel Calvin watching him, could sense the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. The Harley's engine roared to life, but the sound couldn't drown out the turmoil in his head. As he rode away, the heaviness in his chest grew with each mile. It was a feeling he couldn't name, couldn't fight, something that felt dangerously close to caring about what happened to these men who had helped a stranger without asking anything in return. Behind him, 3 men sat in the ashes of their dreams, sharing coffee and maintaining their dignity, while Randy carried their burden down the empty morning roads, whether he wanted to or not. The neon signs of the Broken Spoke Roadhouse cut through the evening darkness like angry red knives. Randy pulled his Harley into the gravel lot, parking among the dozen other bikes already lined up like chrome soldiers. Country music and cigarette smoke drifted out every time the door swung open. Inside, familiar faces dotted the dim bar. His brothers. From the road, men he'd ridden with for 20 years raised their bottles in greeting. But something felt different tonight. The easy camaraderie that usually settled over him like a worn leather jacket now felt stiff and uncomfortable. "Well, if it ain't St. Randy," called out Spider, his lanky frame draped over the pool table. "How's your new charity case going?" Randy grabbed a beer from the bartender, trying to ignore the snickers that rippled through the room. "Just helping some folks who got a raw deal, that's all." "Some folks?" Brick's deep voice cut through the bar noise like a thunderclap. The gang's leader pushed away from the wall where he'd been watching, his scarred face catching the dim light. The jagged mark across his cheek seemed to twist as he smiled. "Those people ain't your concern, brother." Randy's fingers tightened around his bottle. "They helped me out when I was stuck. Nothing wrong with returning the favor." "Nothing wrong?" Brick moved closer, towering over Randy. "You're going soft on us. Playing the savior for a bunch of—" "Watch it," Randy growled, but Brick just laughed. "Time was you knew who your real family was," Brick continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the bar. "Now look at you, running errands for strangers like some kind of Boy Scout." The others joined in, their taunts mixing with cruel laughter. Randy had heard worse over the years, had laughed at worse himself. But tonight, each word felt like a splinter under his skin. "Y'all don't know what you're talking about," Randy muttered, pushing past them toward the door. He needed air that wasn't thick with smoke and mockery. Outside, the night was quiet, except for the crickets and distant highway noise. Randy leaned against his bike, lighting a cigarette with slightly shaking hands. The moon hung low and full, reminding him of endless nights on the road, of freedom and brotherhood. But now those memories felt hollow. In his mind's eye, he saw the burned-out garage again, the quiet dignity in Calvin's eyes, the way they'd helped him without hesitation, asking nothing in return. It stirred something deep inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced since childhood, since kneeling beside his bed while his mother's soft voice spoke of grace and redemption. The cigarette burned down to his fingers, forgotten. Randy barely noticed the sting. His brother's laughter still echoed from inside the bar, but it seemed far away now, like a radio station losing signal. Back at the motel, Randy sat on the edge of the sagging bed, his boots leaving dirt on the worn carpet. The room was silent except for the hum of the ancient air conditioner and his own breathing. "I'm gonna help them," he whispered to the empty room. The words felt strange on his tongue, but right. Even if nobody else does. He barely slept that night, his mind full of burning buildings and extended hands, of sneering faces and gentle smiles. When the first light of dawn crept through the thin curtains, he was already on his bike. The morning air was cool against his face as he rode back to what remained of Cal's auto repair. Calvin was there early, methodically sorting through twisted pieces of metal, setting aside anything that might be salvageable. He looked up at the sound of Randy's approaching motorcycle, his expression neutral but questioning. Randy killed the engine and stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets. The words he'd practiced on the ride over suddenly seemed inadequate. "You rebuild," he finally said, his voice rough but determined. "I'll work free till it's done." Calvin straightened slowly, studying Randy's face. The morning sun cast long shadows across the debris-strewn lot as seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, Calvin extended his calloused hand. "Then I guess you're on the crew," he said simply. Randy gripped the offered hand, feeling the strength in Calvin's grip. It was more than a handshake. It was a contract, a promise, a beginning. Neither man smiled, but something passed between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. And with that quiet gesture in the early morning light, surrounded by the ashes of what was lost and the foundation of what could be, Randy's new life began. The Alabama sun rose bright and clear the next morning, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Randy arrived at the burned-out garage before 7 o'clock, a borrowed tool belt hanging awkwardly from his hips. He felt out of place, like a wolf trying to blend in with sheep. The charred remains of Cal's auto repair looked different in the morning light, less devastating somehow, more like a challenge waiting to be tackled. Randy stood there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, unsure where to begin. Calvin arrived minutes later in his tow truck, nodding a quiet greeting. "Morning," he said, reaching into the truck's bed for work gloves. "Ready to get your hands dirty?" "Born ready," Randy replied, though his stomach churned with uncertainty. Marcus and Darnell pulled up soon after, carrying coffee and donuts. They divided up the work with practiced efficiency, treating Randy like he'd always been part of the crew. No sideways glances, no hesitation, just simple instructions and clear expectations. "We'll start with clearing the debris," Calvin explained, handing Randy a pair of heavy gloves. "Anything metal goes in the salvage pile. The rest is trash." The work was straightforward, but grueling. Randy hauled twisted metal and burned lumber, his muscles protesting the unfamiliar labor. Sweat soaked through his shirt within an hour, but he didn't complain. There was something satisfying about the simple physical work, about seeing the space slowly transform as they cleared away the wreckage. Darnell worked nearby, humming gospel tunes under his breath as he sorted through a pile of scorched tools. The melody was gentle, rising and falling like a quiet prayer. Randy found himself listening, letting the peaceful sound wash over him as he worked. Around noon, Calvin called for a break. They gathered around the tailgate of his truck, sharing sandwiches and cold drinks from a cooler. The conversation flowed easily, centered on cars and repairs, safe, familiar territory. "Man, you should have seen this '68 Buick I worked on back in the day," Marcus said, gesturing with his sandwich. "Owner thought it was dead for sure, but I knew better. Spent 3 weeks rebuilding that engine from scratch." His eyes sparkled with the memory. When she finally turned over, sounded sweet as Sunday morning. Randy listened more than he spoke, soaking in the easy camaraderie between the men. Their friendship was obvious in the way they finished each other's sentences, shared inside jokes, passed tools without having to ask. It was different from the brotherhood he knew, quieter, built on something more substantial than fear and power. The afternoon passed in a blur of work and quiet conversation. Darnell's humming continued, providing a soundtrack to their labor. Sometimes Marcus would join in, his deeper voice harmonizing naturally with the younger man's melody. Even Calvin occasionally tapped his foot to the rhythm as he worked. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cleared lot, the others started packing up their tools. Randy watched them say their goodbyes, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. Something kept him there, broom in hand, sweeping the concrete clean of ash and debris long after darkness fell. The repetitive motion was soothing, almost meditative. In the quiet of the evening, with only the whisper of bristles against concrete, Randy felt a strange peace settle over him. It wasn't the artificial calm of alcohol or the adrenaline rush of the road. This was something deeper, more real. The moon was high when he finally stopped, his arms aching pleasantly from the day's work. The lot looked different now, cleaner, ready for whatever came next, ready for rebuilding. Back at his motel room, Randy stood before the streaked mirror, studying his reflection in the harsh fluorescent light. The man who stared back at him was familiar. The same tattoos snaking up his arms, the same scars mapping old stories across his skin. But something in his eyes had changed. "Maybe there's more to life than the road," he muttered to his reflection, the words hanging in the quiet room. That night, for the first time in as long as he could remember, Randy slept without being haunted by the ghosts of his past. No nightmares chased him through the darkness. Instead, his dreams were filled with the sound of gospel hymns and the satisfaction of honest work. The peaceful sleep felt like a gift, or maybe, he thought, as consciousness faded, it was more like a promise of what could be. Days melted together like summer asphalt as the work continued. Each morning brought its own rhythm, the scrape of shovels, the whir of power tools, and the steady thump of hammers building something new from the ashes. An old radio perched on a wooden crate filled the air with gospel music, its tinny speakers barely audible over the construction sounds. Randy found himself falling into the routine naturally. His hands, once more familiar with handlebars than hammers, grew calloused in new places. He learned to mix concrete to the right consistency, to measure twice and cut once, to hold boards steady while others worked. The physical labor felt good, honest in a way his past life never had been. "Hand me that level, would you?" Calvin called out one afternoon, squinting at a newly framed wall. "Need to make sure we're staying true." Randy passed the tool, watching as Calvin made minute adjustments. The older man's movements were precise, practiced, the kind of skill that came from decades of careful work. Everything had to be perfect, he'd explained, or nothing would line up right in the end. The radio crackled with amazing grace as they worked, and Randy caught himself humming along more than once. He'd never been much for church music, but there was something about these songs that felt right for rebuilding. Around noon, a powder blue sedan pulled into the lot. Louise Booker stepped out, carrying 2 large picnic baskets that made Randy's mouth water before she even opened them. "Y'all need to eat," she called out, setting up on a folding table under the big oak tree. "Can't rebuild on empty stomachs." The smell of fried chicken filled the air, making everyone's tools lower automatically. Louise had brought enough to feed an army: golden brown chicken, fresh rolls, potato salad, and a gallon jug of sweet tea so cold the glass was sweating. Randy held back, uncertain, but Louise wasn't having any of that. "You too, Mr. Carson," she said firmly, holding out a paper plate. "Can't have you doing all this work without proper fuel." Her kindness made him awkward, but he accepted the plate with a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am." The food was better than anything he'd eaten in years, the chicken crispy and perfectly seasoned, the tea sweet enough to make his teeth ache. They gathered in the shade, perched on overturned buckets and makeshift seats. Calvin leaned back against the tree trunk, his plate balanced on his knee. "You know," Calvin said, his voice thoughtful, "when I first opened this place, folks said it wouldn't last 6 months. Said a black man couldn't run his own business in this town." He took a sip of tea. "But I believed in something bigger than their doubt. This shop wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about fixing lives, giving folks honest work and second chances." Randy's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Second chances. The words echoed in his mind, striking something deep and tender. "Hired more than a few men others wouldn't look twice at," Calvin continued. "Some had records, some had troubles. But everybody deserves a chance to prove themselves, don't you think?" Randy nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The chicken suddenly felt heavy in his stomach. After lunch, the work continued. But those words, second chances, kept rolling around in Randy's head like loose change. When the others left that evening, he found himself walking to the front of the property where the old shop sign lay half buried in debris. The metal was scorched, but intact. Randy grabbed a rag from his back pocket and started wiping away the soot, revealing the letters one by one. CAL''S. AUTO. REPAIR. Each letter felt like uncovering a promise. As he worked, cars passed on the main road. Some slowed down to look. Randy felt their stares but kept working. A few people waved, mostly older folks who'd probably known Calvin for years. Others just glared, their faces tight with disapproval at the sight of a tattooed biker working alongside the black mechanics. Randy ignored them all. He had more important things to focus on, like learning how to read a level properly, understanding the right way to frame a wall, and figuring out how to be truly useful for the first time in his life. The opinions of strangers meant nothing compared to the satisfaction of seeing progress each day, of knowing he was part of building something that mattered. By the time he finished cleaning the sun was setting. The letters gleamed dully in the fading light, not perfect, still bearing scorch marks, but readable. Like everything else about this place, it was a work in progress. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Randy helped Marcus secure another beam. A week of steady work had brought the shop's frame back to life, its skeleton rising from the ashes like a promise taking shape. The rumble came first, a deep, familiar growl that made Randy's shoulders tense. 3 Harleys rolled into the lot, chrome glinting like drawn knives in the sunlight. Brick led the pack, his scarred face twisted in a sneer. 2 other riders flanked him, Snake and Tommy, both wearing their colors with pride and malice. The bike's engines roared louder, an intentional show of disruption. Dust kicked up around their wheels as they circled the worksite once, twice, 3 times. Randy's hands tightened on his hammer, knuckles white with restraint. "Well, well," Brick called out, cutting his engine. "Look what we got here. The great Diesel Carson playing handyman with his new friends." He spat the last word like it was poison. Randy set his hammer down slowly, trying to keep his breathing steady. But before he could respond, Calvin stepped forward. His face was calm, but his stance was solid as oak. "Can we help you gentlemen with something?" Calvin's voice carried across the lot, steady and clear. Brick's laugh was ugly. "Hear that, boys? Gentlemen. That's Rich." He swung off his bike, boots crunching on gravel. "Just checking on our lost brother here, making sure he hasn't forgotten who his real family is." "Family don't leave family to burn," Randy growled, taking a step forward. "Family don't betray their own neither," Brick shot back. He turned to Calvin, towering over him. "You think you're saving him? Making him one of your choir boys?" Calvin didn't flinch. "Ain't nobody stealing our peace today," he said firmly. "Not even you." The words hung in the air like summer lightning. Brick's face darkened. He hawked and spat, the glob landing near Calvin's boots. "Peace," he sneered. "That what you call hiding behind your Bible while the world burns?" He swung back onto his bike. "You're dead to us, Diesel. Remember that." The bikes roared to life, spewing gravel as they peeled out. The sound of their engines faded slowly, like thunder rolling away. Randy stood frozen, shame burning in his gut. He'd known those men for 20 years, ridden with them, fought with them, bled with them. Now their contempt felt like acid on his skin. "Take 5, everyone," Calvin called out. "Miss Louise is expecting us for dinner anyway." Randy started to make an excuse, but Calvin's look stopped him. "That wasn't a suggestion, brother." An hour later, they sat around the Booker's dining room table. The house was modest but immaculate, family photos lining the walls. Louise had made meatloaf, green beans, and cornbread that melted in your mouth. The conversation started slow, but as the food disappeared, tongues loosened. Marcus talked about losing 3 regular customers after the fire. "They made excuses," he said, pushing peas around his plate. "But we all knew why." Darnell nodded. "My mama still gets looks at the grocery store, like we did something wrong by not staying down." "Had one fellow pull up last week," Calvin added, breaking another piece of cornbread. "Said he'd give us business if we'd rebuild somewhere else." "More suitable," he called it. He shook his head. "Told him we were exactly where we needed to be." Randy listened, his food going cold. He thought about all the times he'd heard similar words in bars and back rooms, how he'd let them slide or worse, joined in. The shame rose again, bitter in his throat. "How do you do it?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "How do you just take it?" We don't just take it, Calvin corrected gently. We choose not to let it define us. There's a difference. He leaned back in his chair. We don't let hate build our walls. Hate makes crooked lines and weak foundations. What we're building, it's got to be stronger than that. The words hit Randy like a physical force. He thought about his own walls, built of anger and pride, how they'd kept him safe but also kept him trapped. Later, as the evening wound down and the dishes were cleared, Randy lingered on the porch. Calvin joined him, the wooden boards creaking under their weight. You really forgive people that easy? Randy asked, staring out at the darkening sky. Calvin's laugh was soft. Ain't easy. Never has been, never will be. Aduso paused, choosing his words carefully. But it's right. And sometimes doing what's right matters more than doing what's easy. Randy nodded slowly, absorbing the wisdom in those words. The drive home was quiet, just his bike and the stars above. The night air carried the scent of jasmine and fresh-cut grass, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle called out like a lonely prayer. Maybe it's time I learn how, he whispered into the wind, the words carried away into the darkness. The road ahead stretched empty and open, waiting for whatever came next. The early August sun beat down on the construction site as Randy wiped sweat from his forehead. 2 months of hard work had transformed the burned-out shell into something promising. The new garage's steel frame reached toward the sky, a testament to persistence and brotherhood. Looking mighty fine, ain't it? Calvin stood beside him, hands on his hips, admiring their progress. The skeleton of the building gleamed in the morning light, each beam precisely placed, each joint carefully welded. Better than fine, Randy agreed, his voice gruff with pride. The sound of truck tires on gravel made them turn. A red pickup pulled into the lot, followed by 3 more vehicles. Church members from Calvin's congregation stepped out, carrying tools and coolers. Behind them, old Mr. Jenkins, who owned the farm down the road, backed up his trailer loaded with fresh-cut lumber. Heard y'all could use some extra hands, Mr. Jenkins called out, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Randy watched in amazement as more people arrived. The hardware store owner, a retired teacher, even some teenagers on summer break. The lot that had been so empty just weeks ago now buzzed with activity and purpose. All right, folks, Calvin addressed the crowd. We appreciate every one of you being here. Let's put these willing hands to work. Randy found himself surrounded by eager volunteers, asking what needed doing. It felt strange, giving directions instead of taking them, but somehow natural too. He assigned tasks based on skill levels, making sure everyone had something meaningful to contribute. Hey, mister, a young boy tugged at Randy's sleeve. Can you show me how to sand these boards right? Randy looked down at the kid. Couldn't have been more than 12 years old, holding sandpaper like it might bite him. Something soft stirred in his chest. Sure thing, buddy. He knelt down, demonstrating the proper technique. See? Long strokes, following the grain. That's it. Before he knew it, Randy was overseeing a small crew of youngsters, all eagerly sanding planks for the interior walls. He caught himself smiling as they competed to see who could finish first, while still doing quality work. Well, would you look at that? Marcus whispered to Calvin. Old Diesel's running a summer camp over there. The morning wore on into afternoon. Miss Louise and some church ladies set up tables with sandwiches and sweet tea. The atmosphere felt more like a barn raising than a construction site. People laughing, sharing stories, working together toward something bigger than themselves. A car door slammed, and a woman with a camera and notepad approached. Hi there. I'm Sarah Chen from the County Register. We'd love to do a story on the rebuild, community coming together and all that. Randy instantly pulled his bandana up over his face, stepping behind a stack of lumber. His heart raced. He didn't need his picture in any paper, didn't need people knowing his business. Calvin watched him retreat, then walked over quietly. "You know," he said, keeping his voice low, "you should let folks see what change looks like. Might give somebody else hope." Randy shook his head. "My ugly mug ain't giving nobody hope." "That's where you're wrong," Calvin insisted. "People need to see that transformation is real, that it can happen to anybody willing to let it." Before Randy could argue further, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The number made his stomach clench. Brick. "You're done, Diesel." Brick's voice was cold as steel. "Club voted. You're out. Try showing your face around here again. You won't like what happens." Randy's hand shook as he ended the call. 20 years of brotherhood, gone in a 10-second conversation. He leaned against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. But when dawn broke the next morning, Randy's bike was the first to arrive at the site. Calvin and Marcus pulled up moments later, nodding in quiet understanding. No words needed to be said. They worked through the day, focused and determined. By evening, the last roof panel was secured in place. The group gathered in front of the building, taking in the solid shape against the setting sun. The orange sky painted everything in warm gold, making even the unfinished walls look beautiful. Marcus broke the reverent silence. "Now it just needs a miracle sign that says, 'We're open.'" He chuckled, but there was hope in his voice. Randy felt a smile tug at his lips. "Give me a day," he said, already planning how he'd restore the old sign he'd cleaned weeks ago. He might not be welcome in his old life anymore, but here, in this moment, he knew exactly where he belonged. The group stood together, watching the day fade, their shadows stretching long behind them. They'd built more than just walls and a roof. They'd built something that would last, something that spoke of second chances and new beginnings. The sun hadn't yet peeked over the horizon when Randy pulled into the parking lot of Johnson's hardware store. He'd been there waiting since 5:30 in the morning, determined to be first in line when old Mr. Johnson opened up at 6. The bell above the door jingled as Randy stepped inside, the smell of sawdust and metal tools filling his nostrils. He made his way straight to the paint section, where rows of colored samples lined the walls like a rainbow. "Need some help finding something?" Mr. Johnson called from behind the counter. "Yes, sir," Randy replied, surprising himself with his politeness. "Looking for exterior white paint, the really good stuff." He left the store with 4 gallons of premium exterior paint, brushes, and a brand new extension ladder strapped to his bike. The morning air was cool against his face as he rode back to the garage, his mind already picturing exactly how he wanted the letters to look. By 6:45, Randy had the ladder set up and was sketching out the letters with chalk. Each one had to be perfect. He worked carefully, measuring spaces between words, making sure everything would be centered just right. When Calvin's truck pulled into the lot at 7:30, Randy was already halfway done with the painting. The white letters stood out bold and clear against the fresh blue walls. "Grace built this." Calvin stepped out of his truck and stood there, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. Marcus and Darnell pulled up moments later, both stopping to stare at the wall. "Well, would you look at that?" Calvin said softly, a smile spreading across his weathered face. Randy kept painting, careful not to let his hand shake. "Hope you don't mind," he called down. "Thought the place needed something special?" "Mind?" Marcus laughed. "Man, that's the truest thing I've ever seen written on a wall." The morning light caught the wet paint, making the letters gleam like they were lit from within. Randy finished the final stroke and climbed down the ladder, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It's perfect," Darnell said, nodding his approval. Calvin just shook his head, still smiling. "You never cease to surprise us, brother." The rest of the week flew by in a blur of final preparations. Word spread about the weekend reopening barbecue, and people kept stopping by to ask how they could help. Miss Louise coordinated with the church ladies to organize the food. The hardware store donated a new set of tools. Even the local grocery store pitched in with paper plates and drinks. Saturday morning arrived clear and bright. Randy stood in front of his motel mirror, barely recognizing himself. He'd bought a new blue button-down shirt for the occasion, and for the first time in years, he'd taken the time to properly shave. His face looked younger without the scruff, more vulnerable somehow. By noon, the parking lot was filled with cars, and the air was thick with the smell of barbecue smoke. Children ran between the adults' legs, playing tag. Old men gathered around the grills, arguing good-naturedly about the best way to cook ribs. Women set out casseroles and pies on long tables covered in checkered cloths. Randy hung back near the garage door, feeling oddly shy. He watched as Calvin worked the crowd, shaking hands and thanking people for coming. The man had a natural way with people that Randy envied. "Time for speeches," Marcus called out, tapping a spoon against his glass for attention. Randy's stomach dropped. He'd been dreading this part. Calvin spoke first, thanking everyone for their support and talking about community and faith. Then he turned and gestured for Randy to step forward. The crowd grew quiet as Randy made his way to the front. His hands were sweating, and his throat felt dry. He looked out at all those faces, faces that just months ago would have crossed the street to avoid him, and took a deep breath. I ain't much for public speaking," he started, his voice rough. "But I need to say something. These men," he gestured toward Calvin, Marcus, and Darnell, "they showed me what brotherhood really means. I used to ride with hate. Now I work with grace." He paused, swallowing hard. "That's what I painted up there, 'cause it's true. Grace built this place. Grace built me too, I reckon." The crowd burst into applause. Randy saw tears in more than a few eyes, and some of the church ladies were dabbing at their faces with handkerchiefs. Calvin stepped forward and pulled him into a tight hug, something that would have made Randy flinch just months ago. Now it felt right. The party continued as the sun set. Someone had strung up paper lanterns that swayed gently in the warm evening breeze, casting soft circles of light across the lot. Randy sat on a folding chair, watching people laugh and talk, feeling for the first time in years like he might have found somewhere he belonged. As the crowd began to thin out, Randy said his goodbyes and climbed onto his bike. The night air felt good on his face as he rode toward his motel, his heart lighter than it had been in decades. Then he saw them, headlights in his mirror getting closer. The distinctive rumble of motorcycles filled his ears. His smile faded as he recognized the sound of his former brothers closing in. The motorcycles gained on Randy, their headlights burning bright in his mirrors. He recognized the rumble of those engines. He'd ridden alongside them for 20 years. His hands tightened on the handlebars as he took the turn toward the old mill, hoping to lose them on the back roads. But they knew his moves too well. 3 bikes cut him off at the gravel entrance, forcing him to brake hard. Loose stones scattered under his tires as he skidded to a stop. 5 more bikes circled behind him, boxing him in. Brick's massive figure dismounted first, his scarred face twisted in disgust. The moon cast harsh shadows across the abandoned mill's weathered walls as the other riders formed a tight circle. The air felt thick with tension and the metallic smell of oil and leather. "Well, well," Brick's voice carried across the lot. "Look who forgot where he came from." Randy switched off his engine but stayed seated. "I ain't forgot nothing, Brick. Just chose different." "Different?" Brick spat on the ground. "You're working with the same folks whose shop we—" He caught himself, but Randy's head snapped up. "What did you say?" Randy's voice went dangerously quiet. "You set that fire?" Brick's laugh was ugly. "You forgot who made you, brother. 20 years we kept you alive, gave you purpose. Now you're playing carpenter with those—" He used a word that made Randy's blood boil. Randy slowly got off his bike, his hands clenched into fists. "Don't talk about them like that." "Or what?" Brick stepped closer, tobacco-stained teeth bared in a sneer. "You gonna defend their honor? That what they taught you at their little church meetings?" The first punch caught Randy in the jaw before he could react. He staggered but didn't raise his fists. Calvin's words echoed in his mind. "We don't let hate build our walls." "Fight back!" Brick roared, landing another blow to Randy's ribs. "Show me you're still a man!" Randy straightened up, tasting blood. "I am. That's why I won't." The beating that followed was brutal. Fists and boots came from all directions as the gang unleashed their fury. Randy fell to his knees but didn't strike back. Each blow carried years of built-up hatred he used to share. Through swollen eyes, he saw Brick pull back, breathing hard. "You're pathetic," he snarled. "Throw him in the ditch. Let him think about his choices." Rough hands grabbed Randy's jacket, dragging him across the gravel. He felt himself being lifted, then the sickening sensation of falling. His body hit the muddy bottom of the drainage ditch with a dull thud. "Stay gone," Brick's voice drifted down. "Next time won't be a warning." The rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance. Randy lay there, each breath sending spikes of pain through his chest. The first drops of rain began to fall, cool against his battered face. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. As consciousness slipped away, he thought he saw the old shop sign. "Grace built this," floating in his mind. The rain fell harder, and darkness took him. Morning light filtered through Randy's eyelids, accompanied by urgent voices. "Over here!" That was Marcus, sounding scared. "Lord have mercy!" Heavy footsteps slipped down the muddy bank. Gentle hands checked his pulse. "He's breathing, but barely," Calvin's steady voice said. "Call an ambulance. Now." Randy tried to speak, but could only manage a groan. "Stay still, brother," Calvin soothed. "Mrs. Johnson saw the bikes last night. Called us first thing. We're getting you help." The next hours passed in a blur of sirens, bright lights, and worried faces. Randy floated in and out of consciousness, caught between reality and fever dreams. He saw flames consuming the garage again, but this time he was inside, trying to save something precious. He saw his mother's face, young and sad, praying over him as a child. He saw Brick's gang, but they were shadows now, not men. Most clearly, he saw Calvin and the others, working in the sun, rebuilding something beautiful from ashes. Their laughter echoed in his dreams, keeping him tethered to life. 3 days passed this way. Nurses came and went. Doctors spoke in low voices about internal bleeding and cracked ribs. Through it all, Randy was vaguely aware of people sitting with him. Marcus reading sports scores, Miss Louise humming hymns, Calvin's steady presence. When Randy finally opened his eyes properly, morning sun was streaming through the hospital window. His whole body ached, but his mind was clear. Calvin sat in the chair beside him, reading his worn Bible with reading glasses perched on his nose. Randy's voice came out as a croak. "They tried to end it." Calvin looked up, his eyes warm with concern and something deeper, understanding maybe. He set his Bible aside and leaned forward. "Then God must not be done with you yet," he said softly. Randy let those words sink in, feeling their truth in his battered bones. Through the window, he could see clouds drifting across an endless blue sky. the same sky he'd ridden under for so many years, searching for something he'd finally found in an old garage and the hearts of good men. The spare bedroom in Calvin's house was small but bright, with yellow curtains that Louise had sewn herself and a handmade quilt that smelled of lavender. Randy lay there, his body a map of bruises slowly fading from purple to yellow, watching squares of sunlight move across the ceiling. The first few days were the hardest. Every breath hurt, and pride made accepting help difficult. Louise would come in with soup, her movements gentle but firm, brooking no argument about whether he'd eat. "You're skin and bones already," she'd say, setting down a tray of chicken noodle soup and cornbread. "And I won't have you wasting away under my roof." Randy would try to protest, but she'd just give him that look, the one that reminded him of his mother, gone 20 years now, and he'd eat every bite. Darnell visited in the afternoons, usually after his shift at the rebuilt garage. He'd plop down in the wooden chair by the bed, grease still under his fingernails, and share stories about the day's repairs. "You should have seen this lady's face when her Mercedes started purring again," he'd say, grinning. "Thought she was going to hug Marcus right there in the shop." Then he'd launch into another tale, his natural cheerfulness filling the room like sunshine. Marcus took charge of making the house accessible for Randy's recovery. Randy could hear him outside the window, hammering and measuring, whistling old blues tunes between nail strikes. When the ramp was finished, Marcus stuck his head in the window. "First-class wheelchair access, my friend," he announced proudly. "Though knowing you, you'll be running laps before we need it." The pain medication made Randy drowsy, but it couldn't quiet his conscience. One evening, when Calvin came to check on him before bed, the words just started spilling out. "I need to tell you something," Randy said, his voice rough. "About who I really am, what I've done." Calvin settled into the chair, his expression open and steady. "Take your time." So Randy talked. He told Calvin about the bar fights that turned too violent, the protection rackets, the years of hate and anger that had poisoned everything he touched. He spoke of endless highways and empty bottles, of waking up in strange places with blood on his knuckles and holes in his memory. "I've hurt people," Randy admitted, staring at his hands. "Good people. People who looked like you, Calvin. And I told myself it was right. Told myself they deserved it." Calvin listened without interruption, his face showing neither judgment nor disgust. When Randy finally fell silent, exhausted by confession, Calvin spoke quietly. "You can't fix yesterday, but you can build tomorrow." He reached over and squeezed Randy's shoulder. "The man who did those things isn't the man I see before me now." The words unlocked something in Randy's chest. Tears came then, for the first time since his mother's funeral. They weren't pretty tears. They were the rough, painful sobs of a man finally facing his own darkness. Calvin stayed until they passed, his presence steady as a lighthouse. During the long hours of recovery, Randy found himself thinking about the future. Louise had left a notebook and pen on his bedside table, and he began to fill its pages with ideas. He sketched out plans for a community repair fund, a way to help stranded travelers like he'd once been, regardless of who they were or where they came from. He wrote about free roadside assistance, emergency repairs for those who couldn't afford them, teaching young people basic car maintenance. The more he wrote, the clearer the vision became. This could be his way of paying forward the grace he'd received. Darnell caught him writing one afternoon. "What's all this?" he asked, peering at the notebook. Randy explained his idea, expecting laughter. Instead, Darnell's face lit up. "Man, that's exactly what this town needs. You know how many folks get stuck out on those back roads? We could really help people with something like this." 2 weeks after the beating, the doctor finally cleared Randy to walk. Louise insisted on being there for his first steps, hovering nearby like a mother hen. Marcus and Darnell waited on the porch, ready with encouragement or quick hands if needed. Randy's legs shook as he stood, but they held. Step by step, he made his way from the bed to the door, then out onto the porch. The autumn air hit his face, crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke. He gripped the railing, looking out over Calvin's small yard where late roses still bloomed against the fence. Without thinking about it, Randy found himself whispering, "Thank you, God." The words felt strange on his tongue. It had been so long since he'd prayed, but they also felt right. "For what?" Calvin asked quietly beside him. Randy looked at the people around him, Louise beaming with pride, Marcus and Darnell grinning like they'd won a prize, Calvin's steady presence at his side. He thought about the notebook full of plans, waiting inside, about the future stretching out before him like an open road. "For another chance," he said simply, "for showing me what grace really looks like." The winter rain came gentle and steady, tapping against the garage's new metal roof like soft fingers. Randy stood in the doorway, watching droplets chase each other down the fresh paint of their sign. Brothers Keepers Garage. Pay what you can. He held the town newspaper in his hands, still trying to process the headline that stared back at him. From Hell's Angel to Heaven's Helper, a story of redemption. The article spread across 2 pages, complete with photos, one of him working on an engine, another of all 4 men standing proudly in front of their new shop. The writer had interviewed Calvin about their vision, quoted Marcus about community spirit, and even included Darnell's passionate words about second chances. "You gonna stand there all day reading about yourself?" Calvin's voice carried across the workshop, warm with amusement. "That carburetor ain't gonna fix itself." Randy folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his back pocket. "Just making sure they spelled my name right," he joked, though his voice was thick with emotion. The article had done more than tell their story. It had opened floodgates of generosity. That very morning, an elderly woman had dropped off an envelope containing $500 in cash. Yesterday, a local dealership donated parts worth thousands. The biggest surprise came when a towing company 3 towns over went out of business. The owner called and offered them 2 used tow trucks at a price so low it was practically a gift. "God works in mysterious ways," Calvin had said when they got that call. Randy was starting to believe him. They settled into their daily routine, but now with a steady stream of visitors bringing donations. A retired mechanic contributed his entire tool collection. Church groups organized fundraisers. Even the mayor stopped by with a certificate of appreciation and a check from the city council. Randy found himself handling more than just repairs. He became the face of their outreach program, coordinating emergency calls and managing their new 24-hour rescue service. His old life on the road gave him an advantage. He knew every back route and hidden turn in 3 counties. One rainy afternoon, the phone rang. A young man was stranded on Highway 37 with a blown head gasket. Randy grabbed his keys, but Calvin caught his arm. "You sure you want this one?" Calvin asked quietly. "Marcus can take it." Randy was confused until he heard the location, near the old mill where he'd been beaten. He hadn't been back there since that night. "I'm sure," Randy said firmly. "That's exactly where I need to be." The stranded driver turned out to be barely 20 years old, nervous and trying to hide a Confederate flag tattoo on his forearm. His car was an old Chevy, more rust than paint, with a Rebel flag sticker in the back window. The kid wouldn't meet Randy's eyes at first. Randy just went to work, explaining each step as he diagnosed the problem. He kept his voice casual, treating the young man like any other customer. Slowly, the tension eased. "My daddy would kill me if he knew I was getting help from..." The young man trailed off, looking ashamed. From an ex-biker? Randy finished for him, his voice gentle. Or from a shop run by black men? The young man stared at his boots. Both, I guess. Randy wiped his hands on a rag and faced him directly. Let me tell you something about fathers and sons. My old man taught me to hate too. Took me 48 years to learn he was wrong. You're young enough to figure it out sooner. They got the car running well enough to limp to the garage. Randy insisted on finishing the repair himself, talking to the young man about engines, about choices, about life. When the work was done, Randy extended his hand without hesitation. The young man paused, then took it firmly. Thank you, he said. And Randy knew he meant for more than just the repair. Back at the garage, Calvin had watched the whole interaction through the window. As the Chevy drove away, he joined Randy by the tool bench. Looks like Grace came full circle, Calvin observed quietly. Randy nodded, organizing his wrenches with careful precision. He thought about that night months ago when 3 black mechanics had stopped to help a stranded biker who'd done nothing to deserve their kindness. He thought about how that simple act had changed everything. You know something, Calvin? Randy said, looking around at their thriving shop, at the wall of thank you cards from grateful travelers, at the brothers he'd found in this unlikely place. I spent 30 years searching for freedom on the road. Never guessed I'd find it by staying put. Calvin smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. Sometimes the longest journey is the one that brings you home. Outside, the winter rain continued its gentle rhythm on the roof, washing the world clean, promising new growth in its wake. Inside, Randy picked up his tools and got back to work, surrounded by the quiet miracle of ordinary grace. The Alabama sun painted long shadows across Highway 27 as Randy guided the white tow truck down the familiar stretch of road. 1 year had passed since that fateful night when his tire blew out near the old gas station sign. Now he drove past that same spot almost daily, each time remembering how 3 mechanics had stopped to help a stranger who didn't deserve their kindness. The truck's radio played softly, gospel music, just like what used to drift from the portable radio during those rebuilding days. Randy had grown to appreciate its peaceful rhythm, so different from the angry metal that once thundered from his Harley's speakers. Through the windshield, he watched the late afternoon light filter through the pine trees. The Brothers Keepers logo on his truck's hood caught the sunlight, the fresh paint still gleaming. They'd chosen the name carefully, a reminder that everyone deserved help, no matter who they were or where they came from. Up ahead, Randy spotted something that made him slow down. A car pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly in the golden light. As he drew closer, he could see an elderly woman standing beside the vehicle, her silver hair catching the sun. She looked worried, wringing her hands as she paced next to a visibly flat tire. Randy felt a familiar tug in his chest, the same one he'd felt that night outside the bar when he'd first decided to help rebuild Calvin's garage. Without hesitation, he flicked on his amber warning lights and pulled over, positioning the truck to shield the disabled vehicle from passing traffic. The woman watched him approach with visible apprehension. Randy was used to that look. Even in his clean uniform with the company logo, his tattoos and scarred face still made some folks nervous. He'd learned to move slowly, speak softly, and let his actions do the talking. "Afternoon, ma'am," he called out, keeping his voice gentle. "Looks like you could use some help with that tire." She clutched her purse tighter, eyes darting between his tattooed arms and the official-looking tow truck. I called my son," she said hesitantly. "He should be here soon." Randy nodded, understanding. "That's good thinking, ma'am. But it's not safe for you to wait out here alone. Would you let me take a look at that tire?" "No charge. We don't believe in leaving folks stranded." Something in his tone must have reassured her, because her shoulders relaxed slightly. You'd do that?" Yes, ma'am, Randy said, already reaching for his tools. It's what we do. He knelt beside the flat tire, noting how the evening light cast his shadow long across the asphalt. The same light that had painted the sky when Calvin, Marcus, and Darnell had stopped to help him, all those months ago. As he worked, loosening the lug nuts with practiced ease, the elderly woman watched from a safe distance. After a few minutes, she spoke again, her voice softer now. I didn't expect someone like you to stop. Randy paused, a warm smile spreading across his weathered face. That's what someone once said to me, he replied, remembering his own surprise when 3 black mechanics had stopped to help a surly biker. Taught me a lot about not judging books by their covers. He continued working as he talked, explaining each step of the process just like Calvin had taught him to do with customers. The spare tire was in good condition, and soon he had it mounted and secured. There you go, ma'am, he said, standing up and dusting off his hands. That should get you home safe. Just remember to have your regular tire repaired or replaced soon. The woman's eyes were bright with grateful tears. How much do I owe you? Randy shook his head. Nothing at all, just paying forward a kindness someone once showed me. She insisted on at least knowing his name, and he handed her one of their business cards. Randy Carson, from Brothers Keeper's Garage. We're just down on Miller Road if you ever need anything else. As he packed up his tools, she called out one last time. Mr. Carson, thank you. And God bless you. Randy smiled and tipped his hat, then climbed back into his truck. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the elderly woman get safely back into her car. Her words echoed in his mind, reminding him of all the times Calvin had spoken of God's grace. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, the same colors he'd seen that first night when everything changed. Randy steered his truck toward home, toward the garage where his new family waited. The Brothers Keepers sign would be glowing by now, its warm light a beacon in the gathering dusk. Below it, their motto shone clear and true. We're all family here. As he drove into the sunset, the gospel music still playing softly on the radio, Randy reflected on his journey. The memories washed over him like gentle rain. The night his tire blew out, the fire that destroyed Calvin's garage, the beating that should have ended him, and the grace that saved him instead. I ain't no angel anymore, he whispered to himself, his voice blending with the hymn on the radio. But I met a few on that highway. The golden light surrounded his truck as he drove on, heading home to the place where he'd learned that grace could rebuild what hate burns down. Behind him, the setting sun painted the sky in colors of redemption, marking the end of another day spent paying forward the kindness that had changed his life forever. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.